"The swine," said Lariusic. "What a filthy thing to do." Alexei lay in a coma. After the injection his expression had become quite calm, his features looked sharper and finer. The soothing poison coursed through his bloodstream and kept vigil. The gray figures had ceased to act as though they belonged to his room, they departed about their affairs. The mortar had finally been removed altogether. Whenever strangers did appear they now behaved decently, fitting in with the people and things which belonged legitimately in the Turbans' apartment. Once Colonel Malyshev appeared and sat down in an armchair, but he smiled as much as to say that all would be for the best. He no longer growled menacingly, no longer filled the room with heaps of paper. It was true he did burn some documents, but he refrained from touching Alexei's framed diplomas and the picture of his mother, and he did his burning in the pleasant blue flame of a spirit lamp, which was reassuring because the lighting of the spirit lamp was usually followed by an injection. Madame Anjou's telephone bell rang constantly. "Ring," said Alexei, trying to pass on the sound of the telephone bell to the person sitting in the armchair, who was by turns Nikolka, then a stranger with mongoloid eyes. The drug kept Alexei from protesting at this intrusion, then the wretched Maxim, the school janitor, gray and trembling. "Ring," murmured the wounded man softly, as he tried to make a moving picture out of the writhing shadows, a difficult and agonizing picture but one with an unusual, delightful but painful ending. On marched the hours, round went the hands on the dining room clock, and when the short one on the white clock face pointed to 5, he fell into a half-sleep. Alexei stirred occasionally, opening his narrowed eyes and mumbling indistinctly. "I'll never make it, never get to the top of the stairs, I'm getting weaker, I'm going to fall." "And she's running so fast, boots, on the snow. You'll leave a trail, wolves." Ring, ring. 13. The last time that Alexei had heard the sound of a bell ringing was when he had been running out of the back door of Madame Anjou's sensually perfumed boutique. The doorbell rang. Someone had just come to the door of the shop, possibly someone like Alexei himself, a straggler from the mortar regiment, but equally possibly an enemy in pursuit. In any case, there was no question of going back into the shop, which would have been a totally superfluous piece of heroics. A slippery flight of steps took Alexei down into the yard. There he could quite plainly hear the sound of rifle fire very close by, somewhere on the broad street which sloped down to the Khreshchatyk, possibly even as close as the museum. It was now obvious that he had wasted too much time musing sadly in the twilight shop and that Malyshev had been quite right in advising him to hurry. His heartbeat quickened with anxiety. Looking round, Alexei saw that the long and endlessly tall yellow box-like building which housed Madame Anjou's boutique extended backwards into an enormous courtyard and that this courtyard stretched as far as a low wall dividing it from the adjoining property, the head office of the railroad. Glancing around through narrowed eyes, Alexei set off across the open space straight towards the wall. There was a gate in it, which to his great surprise was unlocked, and he passed through it into the grim courtyard of the empty railroad building, whose blind, ugly little windows heightened the sense of desolation. Passing through the building under an echoing archway, Alexei emerged from the asphalted passageway onto the street. It was exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon by the old clock on the tower of the house opposite, and just starting to get dark. The street was completely deserted. Nagged by an uncomfortable presentiment, Alexei again looked grimly around and turned, not uphill but down towards the golden gates which loomed up, covered in snow, in the middle of the wet, slushy square. A solitary pedestrian ran towards Alexei with a frightened look and vanished. An empty street always looks depressing, but here the feeling was augmented by an uncomfortable sense of foreboding somewhere in the pit of Alexei's stomach. Scowling in order to overcome his indecision, he had to go in some direction, he couldn't fly home through the air. He turned up his coat collar and set off. He soon realized part of the reason for his unease: the gunfire had suddenly stopped. It had been booming away almost without cease for the past 2 weeks, and now there was silence in the surrounding sky. Yet in town, in fact right ahead of him down on the Khreshchatyk, he could plainly hear bursts of rifle fire. Alexei should have turned sharp left at the Golden Gates along a side street, and then by keeping close to the back of St. Sophia's Cathedral, he could have slipped home through a network of alleyways. If Alexei had done this, life would have turned out quite differently, but he did not do it. There is a kind of power which sometimes makes us turn and look over a mountain precipice, which draws us to experience the chill of fear and to the edge of the abyss. It was the same instinct which now made Alexei head towards the museum. He simply had to see, even if from a distance, just what was going on there, and instead of turning away, Alexei took 10 unnecessary steps and walked into Vladimirskaya Street. At this point an inner voice of alarm prompted him and he distinctly heard Malishev's voice whispering, "Run!" Alexei looked to his right, towards the distant museum. He managed to catch a glimpse of part of the museum's white wall, the towering dome and a few small black figures scuttling into the distance, and that was all. Coming straight toward him up the slope of Prarenaya Street from the Kreshchatik, veiled in a distant frosty haze, a herd of little gray men in soldiers' greatcoats was advancing, strung out across the whole width of the street. They were not far away, 30 paces at the most. It was instantly obvious that they had been on the move for a long time and were showing signs of exhaustion. Not his eyes, but some irrational movement of his heart told Alexei that these were Petliura's troops. "Caught," Malishev's voice said clearly from the pit of his stomach. The next few seconds were effaced from Alexei's life and he never knew what happened in them. He only became conscious of himself again when he was round the corner in Vladimirskaya Street, his head hunched between his shoulders, and running on legs which were carrying him as fast as they could go, away from the fatal corner of Prarenaya Street, by the French patisserie, La Marquise. "Come on, come on, come on, keep going, keep going," the blood in his temples beat time to his pace. For a little while there was still no sound from behind. If only he could turn into a razor blade and slip into a crack in the wall. But inevitably the silence was broken. "Stop!" A hoarse voice shouted at Alexei's retreating back. "This is it," from the pit of his stomach.